Brilliant. Okay, so I'll go back. So Cate, first I was going to have Anne Fitzpatrick join me, who has been a research assistant with the RTRU, initially with William Levesque, and then with me. And Anne was diagnosed with polio when she was a lot younger, and then has most recently been involved in some research alongside William and then me around the impact of different orthoses on people's ability to mobilise after polio. However, she's not well, and so then I asked Cate to help me, and Cate ended up being called away to a board meeting. So this afternoon I videoed me having a chat with Cate, and so they'll see a bit of a video, but I thought I'd present a little bit to start with, just to give you an idea of where we're going and what we're talking about. So this session is really just to try and explore with you hearing the voices, why it's so important for us to hear the voices of people who live with the experience of disability and the way that we design services and deliver services. So that's what Cate looks like. That's what I look like. And our sort of worlds collide through our involvement with the Burwood Academy of Independent Living, which is the research group that I am also working alongside here in Christchurch. For those, some of you may have heard me talk about this, but Burwood Academy was basically set up by Professor Alan Clark, he was Dean of the Medical School here in Christchurch. He fell off his roof and sustained a spinal cord injury, ended up with paraplegia, and went through the spinal unit and realised that the spinal unit was really well set up for the health professionals, but not for people that live with the experience of disability themselves and need to access the services. So in line with my talk for tonight, he recognised that it was really important that people who live with disability are included in the way services are delivered. So he set up two organisations. One was the Burwood Academy, which looks at research alongside and with people who experience disability. And the second thing was the New Zealand Spinal Trust, which looks at, basically it's people with spinal cord injuries supporting people with new injuries and with old injuries to live well and flourish across the lifespan. So that's the Burwood Academy. Just to give a bit of context, we're both involved in a range of different projects. Like I've mentioned, I'm involved with the RTRU, obviously, and a lot of the research that I do and the teaching that I do sits alongside what I do with Bale. We both teach into ARA. We teach a paper about disability and independent living at ARA, which is the Polytechnic here in Christchurch. I'm involved in some research looking at how people flourish and live well across the lifespan, and that's sort of a program of research with lots of components in it. Cate heads up, she'll introduce herself in a minute, but she heads up Whānau Whānaki, and is also involved with B-Lab and Enabling Good Lives. She sits on the leadership group for that, alongside other things. So just to give a sense of where we come from. My main aim for this session is to try and, this is really what I'm trying to convince you of, that people with a lived experience, which is we shorten to PLEX, need to be included in an ongoing way in service design and service delivery, when we review service delivery, and also if we do evaluation and research. So that's what I'm trying to convince you of. I think it's really helpful to think about the continuum, because when I'm talking to clinicians, which I often am, and they're like, well, what is research? What isn't research? What's audit? Etc. So I tend to, it is a bit of a continuum. Usually they want to know because they want to understand whether they need ethics approval for a certain subject, that project that they're looking at. But essentially what I'm arguing is that it's really important to include people who live with the experience of disability in setting priorities around what needs to be delivered and what needs to be researched, and how things need to be delivered. We need to certainly be including them in co-design. So co-designing services that really meet people's needs. And like I said, meet the needs of people who need to access the services, and not just the needs of people who need to work in the services. And quality improvement projects could include things like clinical audit or evaluation of service delivery, access, process and outcomes. And it's a little bit variable. I can't spell audit, obviously. It's a little bit variable what is audit and what's evaluation. And like I say, it is a continuum. And in terms of ethics, the simple answer is, how are you going to use the data? If it's going to be used outside of your service, you're going to present it outside of your service, then you do need ethical approval in order to share that. Research is sort of another step, I guess, and I'm arguing that people with lived experience need to be included in co-producing knowledge and evidence, not just consulted on. This is, not just participants who sort of provide information, and not just people who are consulted about how to do the research, but actually being involved in the production of knowledge and evidence that can then be used. So that's kind of where I'm going with in terms of the argument. Now, I think at this point, Cate's video should play, which is about 13 minutes, I think. So I'll see if I can get that going for you, and have a listen to Cate and I have a little chat.
The B-side.
Kia ora, Cate. Thank you so much for coming along and being willing to share your thoughts and experiences with the students for this e-seminar. So maybe it would be great if you could start by introducing yourself to the students who are listening, and to other people as well, just so that they have a sense of where you come from.
Hi. Kia ora, Rachelle. Thank you for the opportunity. Ko aura ki te maunga, ko aita ki te awa, ko nai tahi te iwi, ko Price Arawa, ko Vortrus, ko Sutherwood, ko Folk, ko Morris, ko Grace Tokowhano, ko whānau, ko Otatahi Ahau, ko Kai Whakahaere e whānau whanaki, called Cate Grace Tokowingwa. So kia ora to all the students. It's really weird when you do one of these. It's kind of post-COVID and you can't see the students and you can't get the reaction. So I've got your beautiful smiling face, and we hope that will provide some gems for the group today. So I am proudly the kai whakahaere of an organisation called Whānau Whanaki, which helps people to thrive and their whānaus to thrive. But if anybody gets an email from me, you'll see that I have an emoji with a rainbow, because I have lots of wonderful, colourful movies that I play out. So I have a lived experience of 7 to 9, depending on the day, health conditions. And over the years, I've also understand I'm a storyteller and a connector. Put those three things together and I live a very rich life full of many things that make sense to no one else except myself and my tipuna. And really looking forward to watching the next generation of clinicians and the next generation of just Kiwis grow with very different lens than maybe disability and rehabilitation had been before.
Thank you, Cate. So I know that's a very summarised version of your various skills and pies that you play with, and sandpits maybe.
Sandpits, movies, sometimes they're feature length, sometimes they're tiny.
And I know that this week you've been learning about how to use Lego as a way of, as a mode really of engaging with children with autism, is that right?
Autism and social, children on the spectrum, but also the correlations around how that may look for particularly Waitaha children having had a decade of disasters. So you're looking at different unique ways for people to live their best life.
Yeah, fantastic. So we'll try and narrow it down today because we could go lots of different directions, but I'm really keen for you to share with the students why you think it's really important that people with lived experience are included in the way that we set the priorities, design the services, deliver the services, and then do research about whether the services are actually working or not. So yeah, have you got any thoughts about why it's so important for you from your perspective?
I think I could go on all afternoon about this too, having had many different conditions and been in and out of many systems. I think what we often forget as clinicians that we're living in maybe one or two models, and that the people know themselves that they need support and help, and that when clinicians are continually going by textbook, you're forgetting that there's a human in front of you. So when people have got lived experience and then they can feed back into that loop and start to broaden their lens, I think we're much better suited for future and the current practice to help that person thrive. So I remember my own story. Was that appropriate time?
Yeah, be great. Yeah.
Systems? So an example of what didn't go so well for my whānau and I was that early days, so we're talking maybe 15, 20 years ago, the rehab model for me was you arrived somewhere, you were told your plan, you were allocated your practitioners, you knew your specialist was who your specialist was, your GP would probably be your parents, and it was a family doctor, and everything was trusted in that. And you went away and like you're nodding, that was pretty much, there was, even if you didn't feel right or even if the progression wasn't right, there was just this trust model going on. My hindsight now in my 40s would be that the way that occurred wasn't the best for me and set me back. I was given labels from specialists saying, oh, you'll be in a wheelchair by the time you're 30, Cate. Oh, I wouldn't do that. You can't do that. There's no way you can do that. So the language was really quite negative, and that became my narrative and became my truth for a little bit. So that would be a really scary way that I think if we were still practicing like that we'd miss a whole generation of possibility. Positive, I had a fairly recent diagnosis and was feeling quite disabled by the physicality of that. And all my years of experience and living in all these rainbows, I actually kind of questioned my list that I'd been given and said, I think I'd kind of like my nans would have done, have a cup of tea and see if I really get on with these people and do they get me and have they heard me. And so I guess I ended up leading a co-design of my own clinical program. Yeah. I brought my whānau in, I brought my husband into some of those hui and meetings. I brought my niece in who would sit there and write notes. I made sure that my GP was chosen to be part of my team. So my language changed, and so I was self-managing, but I also relied on the clinicians to be able to hold space for me to do that. And today, recently, we were just talking offline, Rachelle, I had another milestone birthday, and I'm 47, happy to say that, still not in a wheelchair and less on crutches because I have a team. And I think that's where clinicians, look, you're all in this because you want to do well for people, and I think sometimes the systems just overwhelm us and we don't get time to do that. So that's true. Different ways of handling it.
Yeah, the systems themselves can be quite disempowering for individuals in whānau. And so obviously explicitly making attempts to include people in their own design of their own health system is really useful. I guess you've also, in your role with Bale, seen examples of where people with lived experience of disability have been included in sort of broader service design in terms of thinking sort of what would an ideal service look like, and have you got any thoughts about the value of that for the service, what it looks like, but also for the people who contribute to that design?
I think that it's been quite a buzzword, co-design, but I'm really pleased that it is. It started quite long time ago, but sort of the last 4 or 5 years, it's really fantastic if you can get us, the people with lived experience, on the ground really early, and whether it's research and new system design, and be able to evaluate and also research along the same pathway. It's just so empowering for both sides. Clinicians get to see how it might play out, but also it empowers those participating to be ambassadors for what's going on as well. And I think that the service then delivers in a much more streamlined way. It's quite a knack to be a great co-designer, so that's also empowering people to learn. And I know the work that we're all doing at Bale, well, often the two-way street opens many other doors. We create pathways, so you might start as a research participant, supporting, you may end up then being an advisor later on down research. Research sprouts off like the kumara vine, and we've got all sorts of different ideas that come to fruition, and then the clinicians can actually, they can see how that could roll out. They're on the ground. They also look at scalability, because of course we are still within a system, or within the bounds of legislation and things like that, that clinicians can actually input back on the best way to work within those frameworks.
Yeah, thanks, Cate. Now, you mentioned before your tangata whenua, and I'm really interested in, is there a unique perspective as a person with a lived experience who also is Maori, and the privilege that we have to work alongside and partner with you as people of the treaty, but also the responsibility that we have? Is there anything that you would say around that?
I think being a Tiwai Pounamu Māori, being South Island Māori, the first thing I always like to share with clinicians is your lens and idea of who and what is Māori may be challenged in any context in New Zealand, actually, particularly now we're so many years down in intergenerational changes, that my blue eyes and blonde hair doesn't make me any less Māori. And I think in the early days of me proudly being Māori for my nan, that was really hard in a clinical space, because I would ask if I could have my whānau to come. And I'm sure that a lot of your clinicians will know about Sue's Pitama, but I remember being told the Meihana model, and she shares the story, and I remember it happening to me, where you can bring as many whānau as you like, Cate, if you really think you're Māori. And there was that point. And Sue's Pitama's one was that we'll say, bring as many people as you like, but there's 2 chairs, one for the clinician and one for the whānau. And so then you have all of these, and in my whānau, quite tall Māori, often male, flanking, like standing around one chair, and everybody's a bit awkward. So there's one around judgment and lens. The second is there's some really richness around holding space, and what we call whanaungatanga, to even in a busy practice, to just take the time to say, okay, whānau, we do know the answers, especially in the early days of diagnosis or non-communicative, that the carers, and any carers, but particularly Māori, there will be people who are significant, who may be able to interpret and contribute to the narrative of what's going on for that person, which helps for better clinical care. And the third part of that is whānau may not be just a spouse or just parents, or whānau will be also determined by the Māori that you're engaging with. And look, I would imagine, thinking of all my whānau, we wouldn't bring 25 people into the clinical space, but we might, but I've never had that happen. It's usually 2 or 3 or maybe 4 or 5 whānau. So be okay with all of that.
I really like your idea of co-designing your own plan, really, your healthcare plan alongside your whānau and alongside the clinicians. And yeah, I think that's a really, really lovely image for us to keep. I'm really aware as clinicians we need to be innovative in the way that we address these issues, and not just expect system change to happen. We also need to change the way we do things at a grassroots level, and some of those things don't require a lot of funding. They just require a different approach, a different way of thinking about it.
And I think that putting that person-centred, but now I go a bit wider, that whānau-centred approach. You know, I've spoken to lots of people before Bale, but even particularly with Bale, while we've been talking about the carer's role, and that often those going through the condition will say, I'm okay, the clinician, I know my clinicians, I know my specialists, I know everybody, I'm feeling great. But I feel for my family member who's going through a lot of change as well. So that one doesn't have to be reserved for Māori. I think that often you might, once you've left, the hospital setting care, you might only see a clinician once a week or twice a week, I always say there's 168 hours in a week. Who do you think's actually with us, with Flex the rest of the time? It's not very often we're on our own. So I think, bringing it together and letting it fit for all whānau is an amazing gift that any clinician could give. Bearing in mind that whānau also have to understand, we're all part of whānaus as well, families, that we also had to understand that clinicians don't have the traditional 3 days to spend with us like a hui, that we also, by coming in to create your own plan, it's okay to put boundaries and set expectations rather than boundaries, to say, hey, we've got 30 minutes today, let me know how your week's been, what do you want out of this? It's just a couple of really simple starts to a great clinical practice that may completely change how your session is for them. And if you're on the 10-minute, 15-minute, 5-minute maybe rounds now, same, just a smile and how are you, you may find doesn't actually take you as long as you think.
Absolutely. Now, you've been around bail for a little while, and you've obviously been around other organisations for a good while as well. What would you say are some of the, off the top of your head, some of the things that rise to the top continuously that are important issues for people with a lived experience, in terms of if you were going to do research or if you were going to do an evaluation of a service, for instance, or design a service, what are the issues that keep coming up to the top that tend to be prioritised by people who need to access and use the service?
Oh, that's a big question.
I know.
Because, well, there's many things, but I guess I will do a little bit of bail, but mainly in all of my worlds.
Yep.
Is the systems often disable people very quickly if the person isn't able to be part of the decision making. And so researching what it means to be, which I think you may have talked about in today's lecture about how to flourishing, that was my first bail understanding, that many of those people I had known in a lived experience world who really wanted to share their story and then contribute to changing the system. That comes up a lot. Carers come up a lot. And then the physicality of just going through body change, what that means, everybody's different where you are on the continuum. And then, as we've just touched on with the Maori side, but also whānau side, is how it impacts people around me. And how will I contribute and participate in society effectively? And often that's probably a really common thing that's staring me right in the face that you forget. People are always going, what is my new normal? Because, clinicians will say we're going to get you back to A, B or C, but actually maybe you want to be at EFG now. And that needs some research and some language and some frameworks around it as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's really helpful, Cate. I will let you go off and find the pot of gold at the end of one of your rainbows.
Wouldn't that be good? With the research we want, we can do anything we want. If I discover that pot of gold, Rachelle, we'll be signing each other up. It's been
we
great.
might even be able to afford a little holiday away, and we could pay for our quarantine when we get back.
Absolutely. Imagine the planning we would do if we were in the same quarantine hotel.
Imagine. Anyway, thank you so much for sharing, and I may come back to you with some questions from students because we've got a Padlet page that people can interact afterwards. Great. So if there's anything that comes up, I might track you down. But
they say
very much.
No problem, Rachelle. They always say, ask a busy person to do something. So always happy to contribute to our next generation of clinicians. No problem. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Cate.
Okay, so I'm not sure if anyone's got any comments at this point that they'd like to feed in. Any reflections based on what Cate has shared, anything that resonated for you or struck you? Okay, what I thought I would do, keep thinking about that. There'll be an opportunity at the end if people want to make any comments or thoughts. But what I thought I'd do for the next little bit is share with you just some examples really of ways that I've been involved in projects that have attempted to involve people with a lived experience of disability through that continuum. And so I thought I'd start with sort of the evaluation and research end of things. So I had the pleasure and the pain of evaluating the New Zealand Spinal Cord Impairment Action Plan, which was established by ACC and the Ministry of Health, and it ran between 2014 and 2019. So there was a team of us that evaluated how effectively that plan had been implemented and what changes it had made to people who experience spinal cord injury. So firstly, we had obviously asked people with spinal cord injury about their experiences, so that they were participants. Also, Matt Aldridge and Johnny Burke as co-researchers both have a spinal cord injury themselves, so that we had co-researchers with a lived experience. We also had advisors, so there was 8 different objectives within the action plan, and we had an individual, 1 or 2 advisors with spinal cord injury on each of those objectives, feeding into the way that we did the research, the sorts of questions we asked, how we interpreted the data, and then how we presented it. So just to give you a sense that we involved people with a lived experience in lots of different ways. And from that, but also from some other work, but I'll first mention about the action plan. So from that action plan, a couple of different specific needs were identified. One, people with spinal cord injury often have great difficulty managing pain. And particularly, and report that traditional sort of pain management services are often not really that helpful for them in terms of managing spinal cord injury related pain, including neuropathic pain. And so from that, we are now co-designing with people with spinal cord injury what an ideal pain service would look like. And so we've got research funding to now co-design that service, and that will be looking at how services are delivered within New Zealand. Secondly, staying on track. So it was identified that people initially find it really difficult when they're discharged home, that they feel unsupported, and they often have developed quite significant sort of secondary health complications because they lack information on, or actually they've had the information but they lack the knowledge on how to integrate that information into the decision making that they make, or decision making around how they manage their changed body when they go home. And so we are now co-designing a program which we think will probably be delivered as an online peer support program, so offered by, led by other people with spinal cord injury, that actually takes people through a series of sessions when they first go home, but also connects them with each other, so they retain connections with peers who are facing similar issues at the same time. So we're aiming to reduce the secondary complications, health complications, but also improve the experience of that transition, and try and reduce that sense of isolation. So those are 2 examples that have come from that, in which we're sort of aiming to explicitly work alongside people as co-researchers and co-designers of those services. The third thing Jean will know about is that we've, within the RTRU, we've been working on, and we're keen to continue to develop a program that supports people to live and manage incontinence after stroke, manage their continence so that they can participate in meaningful life activities and roles. And so Jean and I are currently doing work on getting some funding for that, and that would once again be a co-design process where we include people and carers of people who've had a stroke and experience incontinence in the development of that program. Obviously, we'll also be including service delivery people in all of those projects. But we are explicitly wanting to include people who live with the experience of disability in the design, because we think that that will have a significant impact on its effectiveness. And that we've also, in terms of service development, another thing that we've been involved with is looking at how peer support services are delivered across New Zealand, and got a bit of a cunning plan underway for how we can try and get some additional funding for peer support services. At the moment, peer support is provided, essentially it's a charitable organisations that provide these, and we would argue that it's really significant for people with new spinal cord injury to be offered peer support. And it makes a significant difference in outcomes. So working alongside peer support organisations, we've been doing literature reviews, we've done an evaluation, we've looked at theoretical development to try and understand a little bit more about how peer support works and how the outcomes can be optimised and how you can measure the outcomes so you can prove and show the funder that it has made a difference. So that's just another example. And I also mentioned about priority setting, and that's something that we will intentionally do when we are trying to develop programs, is try and work alongside people with lived experience to understand what's important to research, because otherwise it's our own research agenda, and we're not really working alongside them in terms of determining what's important. So you might do specifically a priority setting exercise, which is what Bale's done, where we've gone through and asked the community what is important for us to be looking at. I was going to mention the last one, which is health equity for ageing Maori. That's a project that currently staff from the Aotearoa are involved with, and that's working alongside Kokore Marae to look at kaumatua and health outcomes and what's important for them and how we could support their equity of health access and health outcome. And so that's once again a priority setting exercise as we design and come up with ideas for research. I mentioned the Flourish project, which I'm kind of trying to develop and get funding for, and we've already got some funding. I've talked to about 40 people who live with the experience of disability about what it means to flourish and live well across the lifespan, and from that we are now, from their feedback, we're also framing up some future research, and one of the things is specifically looking at how people with lived experience can better share their experience and knowledge with policy and program developers within organisations and within local government, etc. So those are other things. But at a really, I'm not saying it's a basic level. At a clinical level, I work with someone who, as a speech language therapist, when she worked in her local area, in her local service, she arranged for inpatient and whānau feedback groups to be set up. And so she ran these groups as focus groups, as discussions. She had tea and scones and things like that, and asked and had a genuine dialogue with those people about what was the service like for you? How did that go? What were the things that you would recommend? What did we miss? It was a low-key but a focused discussion, which was really aiming at getting people to share their experiences. Right, I just wanted to, I'll see if I can get this going. This is This is Josh, who is one of the peer support providers, and he was involved. I brought him on as a co-researcher with me on the last peer support project that I was involved with, and this is him just sharing a couple of thoughts about what he's got out of the process as well, recognising that it's not just us that are learning and gaining from this partnership, but actually it's really helpful for people with lived experience as well.
I think it's important because there's no real formal training for a peer supporter, so we get really good at making it up as we go. And so finding out what works best with different people, different demographics, people with different levels of injuries and things like that. I learn a lot from my colleagues who have those impairments as well. So I think it's just good to have that information on board as a peer support worker. So I would absolutely work with researchers again in this way. I think it's really important to understand what works, how it works, and if it's making a difference and how it's making a difference. And for somebody who's on the front lines working, you don't always have time to stop and reflect and see and sort of develop your skills. Working with researchers is you find out what's working, and you can change the way you're operating and develop your skills from that and the information that comes from the people you're working with. I think
so just we'll finish with some open for discussion, but I really wanted to leave you with I'm hoping that I've inspired you to see the possibilities, but I also recognise that you can sometimes think, well, how do I make this happen within my area of practice, or if I'm interested in research in the future, how is that even possible? So I guess I also wanted to give you some examples of ways that you could be involved. Obviously, establishing some ongoing feedback mechanisms where you're getting feedback from people with a lived experience of disability within your setting about what works for them and what doesn't work for them, what is barrier and what is a facilitator. And that usually is not just an exit survey, which generally won't give you wonderful information. Sometimes it does take more of that discussion, sort of time to actually sit down and engage with people, and particularly giving them permission to say, we really want to hear what could be improved. We would love to hear your thoughts, so that they don't perceive that they're criticising your service, because that can be quite a significant barrier for them sharing their thoughts. Clinical audit is obviously something we're really keen on, and within the RTRU, because we think that that we can often have really we can be a little bit unclear about what we actually offer, and we can often think that we're doing better than we are, or vice versa. And sometimes actually gathering information about what we actually do and don't do, not just what we think we do and don't do, can be really helpful. And including the voices of disabled people in those clinical audits can be really, really helpful as well. At a really basic level,
Rachelle, it's Jean, and I'm just going to interrupt you to say next year we're running a paper called Rehab 710, and that's the main focus of it.
Yeah, I know, clinical audit, it's great. And everyone who does that paper, even though they find it a challenge, come away going, that's a really useful skill. I use that all the time in an ongoing way. So thank you, Jean, that's a great plug. And I'll reinforce that one. In terms of being aware of disability advocacy and or advisory groups, attending meetings sometimes, just to listen, not to go along to do a presentation, but just to say, hey, I am a clinician, I'm really interested. What is it important for you? Can be incredibly helpful and give you a clearer understanding. There's nothing quite like hearing people's stories to help you think, right, okay, I need to really evaluate this again. And certainly listening to people's experiences can be really transformative in the way that you practice, particularly if you really listen. And so asking disabled people to come in and audit your service, we welcome you to come and give us advice, just like you have OSH audits or other audits. Would it be worthwhile having inviting people in to come in and make recommendations? That's another possibility. Obviously, clinical research is a way that you can get involved. And I've worked as a clinician for 20 years. I started my journey before I got into this academic role as a clinical researcher, doing research within my clinical setting. And really, I can't emphasize enough how invigorating and inspirational it was for my practice. It really inspired me to think about why I was doing what I was doing, and to try and change it. Now, to be fair, I was doing qualitative research. I'm not sure if you get the same joy out of quantitative, but I might be biased. But actually taking time to do qualitative research within the area that I was working really was, like I say, transformative. That led for me to a master's and a PhD, and it's not for everybody, but that is certainly something that you can do, and it is something that we can support you with within the RTRU. So come to us if you've got any ideas or any things that inspire you or drive you, and we can explore some funding options with you as well, because there are options for funding, and there's the options sort of through the universities in terms of scholarships and things, but I also just want to give you an example.
Rachelle, I'm going to interrupt again.
Yes.
Sorry, it's Jean speaking again, and say, even if you're not interested in doing a master's or a PhD, that doesn't stop you coming to RTRU with an idea, looking for research collaborators.
Absolutely.
As Rachelle says, not everybody wants to do a master's or a PhD, but lots of people would really like to do clinical research and would like to be supported to do it. And the thing about universities is they are set up because they're research intensive institutions. So we're set up with really great facilities to support research. So, you don't have to be thinking you want to do a master's or a PhD to come looking at the RTRU for research collaborators.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, actually, Jean. Sorry, I hadn't considered that, but actually I've done a number of research collaborations alongside clinicians, and so I've kind of just acted as an advisor and supporter for them, and been a guide for them. So that's that's a really fantastic thought. So there's this new pathway for clinical research which has become available. The Health Research Council is now offering a Health Delivery Research Career Development Award. You have to apply for it, obviously, with an idea, but it's specifically aimed at supporting clinicians to get involved in research and staying as clinicians. Not necessarily having to stay as clinicians, but encouraging clinicians to do research. And so there are these funding opportunities now, which we can, direct you to and point you to and support you with applying for. So that's another way that you could, if you were really interested in exploring how to include the perspective of people with lived experience in it, or as part of a research question, then there's something that we can do. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and just really interested if anyone's got any thoughts or comments. Essentially, I was hoping that you would just hear some of the possibilities, and but also be convinced that it's a really good thing to do.
I have a question about research funding. Do you find, and I'm thinking more about more of that formal research than like clinical audit, do you find it's more difficult to get funding for qualitative research rather than quantitative?
Jean, feel free to pop in at any point. My initial reaction is, at some levels, yes, but in other ways, no. Increasingly, Health Research Council lotteries are looking for research which is co-designed and is looking for ways that you are building capacity and skills in both disabled people, but also in people who have long-term health conditions or Maori, and often those research designs are have a qualitative component to them, quite a strong qualitative component. So it just depends. There's some funds you're pushing it uphill, but not always. And I think it's just being a bit savvy about where you go. Jean, have you got anything extra to add to that? You're on mute.
Absolutely. And I think that sometimes too it depends on the size of the project. That actually, it's the really odd thing about funders. Some funders are happy to fund really quite small pump priming types of projects, and they may be more used to funding smaller qualitative bits of work that are precursors to rather bigger pieces of work. Whereas some funders who are really funding very, very substantial things, they don't tend to fund qualitative only projects. They'll fund things that are what we call mixed methods. So they've got qualitative and quantitative components, for example. So it's partly about scale as well.
Mm.
Cool, thank you.
I mean, for example, a lot of our master's students do qualitative projects and recruiting up to maybe 8 to 12 participants. And typically we find that, within University of Otago funding models, we can support that amount of research without them having to go looking for funding to do that. Oh, I should say Sarah Lilas last night, if you listened to Sarah Lilas either on the recording or live last night, Sarah Lilas is an example of that. She did a qualitative study of 8 people with mild traumatic brain injury and experiencing fatigue at work, and how they managed it. And that was done as part of a master's degree, and Sarah didn't need any extra funding to do that. We managed to find the supports for that within the RTRU.
Would that apply to PhDs as well, or are you looking more at mixed methods?
Well, often a PhD, to fit the criteria for a new and novel kind of area of research, will have a number of phases. And so it might include a systematic review of literature, for instance. Then it might involve a qualitative study to explore a concept in more detail, and then it may involve a quantitative study which is trying to implement something or try something out, something new out. So often PhDs are multi-phase projects which involve a range of types of research, and there's various ways to get funding for a PhD. Jean, maybe you could summarise some of the different ways.
Yeah, so firstly, there are University of Otago postgraduate scholarships for PhDs, and there's more of them for PhDs than for masters. They're incredibly competitive, of course. And you do need a very high grade point average and various other things to get one. They do exist, and they're available throughout the year. As Rachelle said, there are various career development awards around. So for example, if you identify as Maori or a Pacifica person, then the Health Research Council has some designated scholarships to support capacity building in research for people who identify as Maori or Pacifica. Again, as Rachelle says, the HRC has got some career development awards for people who are clinicians and are wanting to do health services delivery type research specifically. So there are avenues like that. And in terms of funding support for PhDs, it's not uncommon for somebody who begins. Many of our PhD students that we supervise in RTRU and within University of Otago, Wellington are clinicians, and they're working part-time and studying part-time, doing a PhD over, say, 5 years. And so many of them embark on a PhD, and often the early phase, at least the first one or maybe the first two, doesn't require a lot of funding. And most university departments have a system where students who are doing that early type of work and just need a bit of pump priming funding, the university grants them, $500 or $1,000 or whatever to do that sort of work. And then as part of the PhD process, one of the skills they develop, because one of the things you're doing when you do a PhD is you're becoming an independent researcher. That's really the outcome we're really looking for, is that at the end of a PhD you could be an independent researcher. So one of the skills you might gain on the course of doing a PhD is actually making funding applications. And so you may apply to a bequest fund, or you may apply to Health Research Council, or you may apply somewhere for a reasonably small but nevertheless substantial, if you were having to fund it yourself, some thousands of dollars to support a particular piece of research. So there are multiple ways of getting support to do the research. The thing about most scholarships is they're funding your fees and not the research itself. So most support for PhDs or whatever comes in the form of fees supports, rather than, and maybe stipend, depending on what type of scholarship it is, but they don't typically give you money to actually do the research itself. So you typically have to find that somewhere else.
The other thing just to keep an eye out is that if some of the big research programs apply for a fund, they might put in for a PhD student to do some of the work as part of their work. So one of the aims of my Flourish project is to get to the stage where I could bring on a PhD student to work alongside me, so that we can sort of work together. So it's worth keeping an eye out for researchers who are working in your area of expertise to see if they are looking for a PhD student to work alongside them. So that's another option. You do a bit of hustling, basically. You try to keep lots of irons in the fire and see what comes. Does that answer your question, Alison?
Yes, thank you very much. It certainly does.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Is there anything else from anyone else at this point? Otherwise, I will finish the session. If you've got anything that comes up, do add it to the Padlet page, just a comment or a question that you want me to raise with Cate or with Jean or I about different aspects of ongoing research and study and things. But thank you so much for coming to this evening's session, and lovely to see you all, and we'll look forward to connecting with you in various ways across the coming weeks. All right. Thanks, guys. Bye.